Hi, and welcome to the last lecture in English Linguistics 315. I'm going to wrap up language variation today, which is going to be the last portion for your final exam. So we were talking about Labov and his New York department store study in the last lecture. And so one of the methodological issues with that kind of methodology is that it's called the observer's paradox. That is, basically, when you observe a person and ask a person to talk and write down what he is saying, it is kind of difficult because the person is not speaking naturally when they know that they're actually being observed. So that's called the observer's paradox. And then there could also be perception errors because Labov was really relying on what he thought the person was saying, and that's actually, tricky. So the last thing that I want to talk about is how do we actually analyze variation? And we very often talk about social markers or linguistic features whose usage correlates both with the social group and with the speech style of that particular social group. So when we talked about speakers in New York City, they know that when you speak without the R, it's actually a social stigma, and therefore they consciously adopt using the rolled R. This is called a change from above because they know that this is actually a social stigma, and therefore they want to change, and that's called a change from above. There is another kind of change, and this is called a change from below. And here, this is an example of a vowel shift. It's called the Northern Cities vowel shift. So here's an example of the Northern Cities vowel shift from your textbook. So this is the example where a lot of vowels actually shifted in cities such as Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, etc. And this kind of variation, we do not know why this exists, right? So this happened at a particular time. We don't know why it happened. This kind of change is actually very subconscious, and therefore it's called a change from below, right? And this is not a socially stigmatized kind of change, and that's why we call this a change from below. There are different factors of variation. Some of these include age, gender, class, race and ethnicity, and social networks. And when you talk about age is really simple. Basically, there's a generation gap when you speak with your parents or if you have children. When you speak to your children, you know that there is a generation gap. And very often people change their language because of things that they learn from their peers, things that they have learned from like pop culture, media, etc. And therefore, again, we can conclude that language change is real and language change happens today as we're speaking right now. Labov actually used a kind of studies called as apparent time studies to illustrate this kind of change. And so what he looked at was the vowels in COT and CEU, GHT, and you can see that there was a lot of variation within age. So if you were old, you probably merged, you kept the distinction between COT and CEU, GHT. Middle-aged groups show variations as a group, and then all young speakers merge COT and CAU GHT. So depending on age, you actually get a difference between whether you merge the two vowels in COT and CAU GHT or whether you keep them distinct. Gender, now this is a class that I can teach for an entire semester, so I'm not going to be saying a lot. There are other classes in WSU as well that you can take about language and gender. Do women and men speak differently? Yes. Right, that's really the very basic thing that I can tell you. There's a lot of controversy in this, but really people have shown that women use more standard forms than men. Therefore, women are more conservative in speaking, but they also tend to be leaders of linguistic change. So it's really a paradox, right? On one hand, women use more formal and standard forms, but on the other hand, they're also innovating and creating new words, right? So one or the other extreme, basically, when it comes to gender. The person who studied gender the most is Peter Trudgell, and this is in England. And what he studied was the ending in ing. So the standard form is ing, but you can also reduce and contract that and say in without the j, the ing, right? And so he found out that the n ending was used both by the working class and by males, whereas women tended to use more of the standard form, the ing. And so this has to do with connotations of masculinity and working class speech, for example. There is some kind of hidden prestige associated with the speech, and that's probably why men continue to use features of working class speech because they really, really want to be masculine. They want to be identified with other peers, etc. And remember that for many, many years, women's class was defined by the class of her husband, right? And so this is something that is useful to keep in mind when we look at, you know, studies that have been done in 1950s and 1960s. Another important factor in variation is class. Then, depending on what class you belong to, you actually speak differently. The classic examples of this is in the play by George Bernard Shaw called My Fair Lady or Pygmalion. And very often, this is also seen in American dialects, even though it's much more subtle than British dialects. So here are the breakdown of class categories: upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and lower class. And women were categorized by occupation of the husband. So again, just to remind you that these class differences are mostly for men. The lower middle class is actually the class that creates the more variation in language. And they create both hyperstandard forms and hyper non-standard forms. Hyperstandard forms is please come to dinner with my wife and I, right, which is the really correct way of saying it, and not me and my wife, right, or I and my wife. You say wife and I. And the hyper non-standard form is when you use forms like IN because of masculinity and reasons that we spoke about, where they want to be connected to their peers rather than the formal standard form ING. So just to summarize language variation, there are two methods of studying language variation: dialectology and sociolinguistics. We all speak a dialect, we all speak with an accent, and language variation correlates with a lot of different factors such as age, gender, and class. And the reason why some dialects have more prestige than others is because of the socio-political reasons, and the language and the dialect distinction is completely arbitrary.